Welcome to History 112, Lecture 17, An End to Idealism and Reform. While World War I itself begins to show America backing away from some of the reforms, some of the things it had done during the Progressive Era, it still enters the immediate post-war period very idealistic and optimistic. So Wilson's going to go to Paris for the peace conference and try to use the American role in the war to create a new world order based on a foreign policy known as Wilsonianism. It's based on the 14 points. And what he's trying to do is create a world order in which war is no longer necessary and countries are going to settle things through an international body he calls the League of Nations, where all disputes will be settled peacefully. And he really believes he can do that based on these principles and based on ideas like national self-determination for all peoples. So he wants to create a very idealistic, democratic, peaceful world. And Wilson's roadmap for this peaceful world he's envisioning is something he delivers to Congress in January of 1918 during the war. And his major tenets create this broad-based idea of national self-determination with free trade and freedom of the seas, open diplomacies, no more secret treaties, arms reduction across the board, impartial settlements of colonial claims, this idea of the League of Nations, and he really does try to enshrine this idea that everything would be based on promoting world harmony and peace through calm, considered negotiation and arbitration, and all these alternatives to warfare. Wilson's idealistic notions, though, immediately hit major obstacles in the form of Clemenceau and David Lloyd George. These men are in no mood to show generosity towards defeated Germany. Republican leaders back in the United States are also really upset with Wilson because he doesn't bring any of their leadership with him as part of the American delegation to the peace conference, so he's facing some opposition at home and some opposition from the other major powers at the peace table. Wilson also is going to majorly miscalculate by asking voters in the 1918 election to return a Democratic majority of Congress and claim that the failure to elect a Democratic Congress would be interpreted as a sign of political weakness and harm his position, and he needed this strong backing at home in order to win what he wants at the peace table, and that's ultimately going to blow up in his face domestically. Now, Wilson, when he arrives, though, is going to get a very big, grand welcome, and it's going to seem like Wilson is showing up as this important figure and this real hero to the world, but this idealism is very quickly challenged and vanishes. The British and the French are just war weary and they're done. The civil war in Russia has unsettled a lot of people at the peace table, and things are getting really bad there in Russia. The United States, along with some of the other allies, are having to send troops into what's now the Soviet Union to try to stabilize things and try to support the counter-revolutionary forces battling the Bolsheviks. So as this is all going on and as things are unfolding, and this civil war in Russia is causing this major hitch in all of the peace talks, Wilson is ultimately going to be forced to back down on a lot of his proposals in order to get anything done at all. In particular, Wilson has to back down immediately on freedom of the seas and free trade because that challenges the British imperial position and the British will not get on board with it. And in addition, Britain had promised to give German colonies in the Pacific to Japan, which went very much against the proposals Wilson had for how to deal with colonial claims. And where Wilson really has to back down and becomes the most damaging for him is the idea of reparations. Britain and France want Germany to pay all of the debt that they incurred during World War I, and Wilson is ultimately forced to accept that. And it ends up saddling Germany with this debt that's absolutely insane and can really not realistically be paid off anytime soon. It's going to cripple the economy, and Wilson knows this. And every time he turns around, he has these idealistic notions, but nothing gets done. Well, Wilson is forced to make one important concession after another, and each of those really starts to dismantle his vision for this peaceful, harmonious world. He is able to trade those concessions to get a couple of important victories. First, he creates a mandate system for a lot of the former imperial possessions, and they're going to be placed under the control of the League of Nations. And what that's going to say is ultimately those colonies are supposed to receive independence at some unscheduled future date. So he does win this idea that colonialism will someday have to end, and that this League of Nations he so desperately wanted is going to play a major role in that. And the League is his really big win because he is able to get the people signing the treaty to agree to create this and agree to give it a try as an international organization intended to preserve peace and oversee international affairs. And the Allies vote in January 19 to go ahead and accept it and form it. So Wilson returns to the United States having his one big victory he's had to trade basically everything for. And when he brings back the League of Nations, he faces significant opposition when he returns from the Republicans. There's a small group of Western isolationists in the Senate that are known as the Irreconcilables who will oppose the League on any and all principles, and they will made it known they were going to refuse to ever sign the thing. They will have no part of it. There's a larger group called reservationists who oppose the treaty for partisan other reasons, and they have made it known they will support the treaty if Wilson would accept some modifications. So Wilson has to get the treaty through the Senate, and he has a significant block of opponents, some who will never vote for it at all, and a handful who are willing to vote for it if Wilson will go back to the table and renegotiate part of it. Now for Wilson, that's not really an option, so he's faced with trying to battle this treaty as is through a hostile Senate. Now, Wilson decides the best way to get it through a hostile Senate is to take his case directly to the American people and leverage political pressure to get it done. Every 2 years, there is a change of 1/3 of the senators, and he knows that. So he's looking at trying to see what he can do in the next election to unseat some of his opponents and get his treaty through. And he's going to go on this massive speaking tour across the country trying to get support for it. However, when he does this, he ultimately falls ill and suffers a major stroke when he comes back to Washington. At this point, Wilson's a virtual invalid, and he becomes extremely stubborn and demands that the Senate is going to go ahead and vote down any version of the treaty that deviated from his own. So there are people supporting his treaty, trying to work through a compromise, but Wilson won't back down for anything. And we should remember that he's fallen very ill and he's become extremely stubborn, and this is not really an option for him. While Wilson is opposed to any kind of modified treaty, there are that group of reservationists in Congress who are trying to get a modified treaty through the Senate. November 1919, it comes up for a vote, and it's going to be voted down by the Irreconcilables and the Senate Democrats. And then they're going to follow this with a vote of the treaty as is, which is also going to fail later that month. And so Wilson goes back to the American people and says the 1920 election would be, as he put it, a solemn referendum on the League. In other words, if the League of Nations was something that we were going to have and needed, then it would be up to the American people to vote out all of the people who voted against it and vote in people who would support Wilson. And in other words, Wilson said, here, America, this next election, you decide. If you vote the right people in, we'll push it forward. Well, America doesn't vote that way, and in the end, League membership basically dies there. One of the big reasons that the League dies when Wilson puts his case to the American people is that at this stage they have other things on their mind. There's a serious decline in demand at the end of the war, and inflation's rising for the lifting of wartime wage and price controls, so there sets off a massive recession, and in 1919 alone there's 3,600 organized strikes against various companies. People are seeing economic chaos, they're seeing strikes. The idea of reform itself really isn't popular anymore, and people want to get back to normal, as they put it. And so all this talk about this new world order and this world based on peace and harmony really wasn't appealing to the American people. They were more concerned with how do we get the economy out of this recession and how do we really get things rolling again. Now, America's hostility to further reform and change is most evident when it comes to looking at the 1919 strikes. There are three big ones worth knowing. The Seattle General Strike stops and cripples the entire city, and public opinion very much turns against the workers. There's the Boston Police Strike, and once they go on strike, rioting and looting occur. The entire police force is going to be fired as a result of that, and that Boston's going to hire a brand new one, thus settling the strike. And in September 1919, 350,000 workers in different cities are going to walk off the job, and it's going to collapse because the steel leaders are going to simply decide to bite the bullet and break the union, and they're going to use force and non-union labor to keep the mills running, and in the end these strikes fail, and people reading the newspapers are very hostile to strikes, and American public opinion is just very much against them, and there's no support whatsoever for what they're trying to do. African Americans likewise are going to be seeking reforms right around 1919, and they're going to want greater rights and expanded economic opportunities. And they are also going to want to retain the factory work and other jobs that had happened during World War One. But both of these things are going to be very disappointed. And there's a very sharp increase in overt discrimination and racial hatred. There's also an increase in lynching and a widespread layoff in northern cities. So African Americans are going to immediately feel the bite of this return to a lot of the way things had been before the progressive era had started us down a reform path. This sharp increase in race-based hatred is going to lead to what's called the Red Summer, wherein violent riots are going to happen in Chicago and a lot of other urban areas during the summer of 1919. And a lot of African American leaders are going to urge retaliation for the attacks on their communities that they are seeing during these race riots. In the end, Marcus Garvey, who is one of the major leaders, is going to win widespread support with his calls for black nationalism and try to organize a movement, but he is going to ultimately suffer serious setbacks. His movement is going to collapse when he is charged with business fraud in 1923 and deported from the country. But for about 4 years there, he has a very strong growing movement that is really looking to see pride in African American heritage and what he calls black nationalism, rejection of assimilation into white society, and the building of strong black communities that can be independent of the rest of society. It's very popular with a certain segment, but the government definitely goes after him and makes it a point to shut down his movement by shutting him down himself and deporting him. Now, side by side with the Red Summer is the Red Scare. Now, we want to be sure we don't get these two confused. The Red Scare really comes out of fears from the Russian Revolution, all the labor unrest at home. And there's a determination among middle class Americans to preserve order and stability with violence if necessary, and that violence is very much targeted at labor and labor unrest. Now, there's also radical groups who are determined in 1919, 1920 to bring about these labor reforms with force if need be, and that just further fuels the crisis. And 30 states are going to go ahead and pass peacetime sedition laws, and there's going to be acts of popular violence against suspected radicals, and it's really going to feel to people at the time like the country's on the edge of civil war and anarchy, and it's really a very much a capitalist versus socialist thing, especially in the minds of the middle class who see communists around every corner, and it's this real panic that grips the nation. Now, at the federal level, this feeds into the Palmer raids, and they're going to go ahead and try to capture suspected radicals and communists, and the raids are named after the Attorney General at the time. Now, they're going to do very little in terms of uncovering weapons or plots to overthrow the government, and very little to actually uncover these violent radicals. Now, there were a handful that made a lot of newspaper coverage, but people in America thought they were literally under every rock, and the Palmer raids show that there really weren't. There really wasn't that much to it. But it's going to lead, though, significantly to the deportation of nearly 500 alien radicals. So the Palmer raids are not going to uncover the plots they thought they were going to, but they are going to use it to silence a number of major players in the labor and socialist movements who happen to be foreign, and they're going to get deported as a result of this. The Red Scare is going to die down quite a bit after the Palmer raids because the Palmer raids failed to uncover evidence of significant and extensive plots in addition to the few bombings that did actually occur. But the legacy is going to continue throughout the 1920s, and one of the key cases revolves around two Italian immigrants, Niccolo Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti, who are going to be found guilty of murder in Massachusetts despite some pretty questionable evidence. And what the case really comes down to is the national atmosphere was poisoned. These individuals were immigrants and anarchists. These were people who were believed to be radicals. Therefore, when they went to trial, they were convicted more for their political beliefs and for being foreign than they were for actually having committed the crime. Now, there are going to be public demonstrations asking for a pardon for these two men, but the government's going to refuse to yield, and they're ultimately going to be executed in August of 1927. Now, historians have looked into this, and what they basically seem to have concluded is that while these two individuals may very well have committed the crime and probably did it, America convicted them not because they were guilty, but because they were foreign and because they were anarchists. In the period immediately following World War I, there is one significant victory for reform, and that's the passage of the 19th Amendment, and that's going to grant women the right to vote, and it's going to have been the culmination of a lot of struggle. Now, that said, The economic downturn after the war, the racial strife, the challenges with radicals and labor, and the violence and the Palmer raids and the Red Scare and all of that are going to lead people to want to back away from all that reform. So the 19th Amendment goes forward, but everything else is really slowly coming to a halt. And the 1920 election really comes down to a man named Warren G. Harding running. He is a man who is not particularly distinguished, and he makes one promise, which is he is going to bring the country back to normal. And he gets about 60% of the popular vote, and it signals really the end of the progressive fervor that had marked the beginning of the 20th century. Everything really slows, and we get into Warren Harding's administration, which is really, when it comes to government action, kind of boring. So what's the big idea here? Well, Wilson's concerned with the League, but he can't get it through the Senate. Now, the American people, on the other hand, are concerned with things like the recession, or strikes, or race riots, or the Red Scare. Now, where there is significant action and movement is that women get the vote. But by and large, once World War I is over, what people really want isn't reform. They want, as they put it, a return to normalcy. See you in the next lecture.